The suitcase stood by the front door for 20 years, and no one in the family knew why. It was old, brown, and worn at the corners, with two brass locks that had turned dull from time. It did not look valuable. It did not look important. And yet my father treated it as if it carried something heavier than clothes, heavier than paper, heavier than anything a child could understand. Every house we lived in, every apartment, every rented room, every place we tried to call home, the suitcase always stood near the door, never in the closet, never under the bed, never in the attic, always by the exit, as if one day, without warning, he might pick it up and leave. When I was little, I thought it was an adventure. I imagined maps inside it, secret letters, maybe money, maybe treasure from the old country. But as I grew older, the suitcase became something else. It became a question nobody wanted to ask. My mother never touched it. My sister avoided looking at it. And my father, who could fix anything with his hands but explain almost nothing with his words, never opened it. Not once. Not even when we moved. Not even when the handle cracked. Not even when I asked him why it mattered so much. He would only look at it for a moment, with that tired, distant expression he carried like another piece of luggage, and say, "Some things are easier to carry when they stay closed." I hated that answer. I hated the suitcase. And for many years, I think I hated the silence it brought into our home. My father came to America with one suitcase, one coat, and a photograph he kept folded in his wallet until the edges went soft. He never spoke much about the place he left behind. When relatives called it home, he would smile politely, but he never used that word himself. To us, home was the small apartment above a bakery where the pipes rattled in winter and the windows shook whenever trucks passed below. Home was the kitchen table where my mother counted bills after dinner, pressing her fingers against her forehead as if numbers could hurt. Home was my father coming back after 2 shifts, his shirt smelling of metal, flour, oil, or rain, depending on what work he had found that week. He was a quiet man, not cold, but difficult to reach. His love came in practical forms: a repaired bicycle, a packed lunch, shoes left drying by the heater before school, a hand on the back of your chair when you were sick. He almost never said, "I love you." Instead, he said, "Eat before it gets cold," or "Take my jacket," or "Call when you arrive." As a child, I accepted that. As a teenager, I resented it. The suitcase became the center of that resentment. It stood there like proof that part of him was always ready to go back to a life he never described. Whenever my mother suggested moving it somewhere else, he refused. Not angrily, that would have been easier. He simply said, "No, it stays there." And because my father rarely insisted on anything for himself, everyone let him have that one strange thing. But I noticed, children always notice what adults pretend not to. I noticed how he looked at it on certain evenings, especially after letters arrived with foreign stamps or after he heard old songs on the radio. I noticed how, during family celebrations, when everyone laughed too loudly and pretended the past had no teeth, his eyes would sometimes drift to that suitcase near the door. I noticed that on the anniversary of our arrival in America, he cleaned it with a cloth, gently, as if wiping dust from a grave. When I turned 16, I finally asked him if he planned to leave us. It was cruel, and I knew it the moment the words left my mouth. We were in the hallway. He had just come home from work, his hands cracked from cold, his shoulders bent with exhaustion. The suitcase stood between us like a third person. I pointed at it and said, "Why do you keep it there? Are you waiting for the day you can go back? Are we just your second life?" My mother heard me from the kitchen and went silent. My sister stopped doing homework at the table. My father did not answer right away. He took off his cap, folded it once in his hands, and looked at me. There was no anger in his face. Only something worse. Hurt. But old hurt. The kind that had already survived too much to defend itself. He said, "You think I kept it because I wanted to leave?" I crossed my arms, ashamed but too proud to step back. "Then why?" I asked. He looked toward the suitcase, then at the floor. "Because I needed to remember that I already did." Then he walked past me into the kitchen, washed his hands, and sat down for dinner as if nothing had happened. For years, I thought that was another one of his impossible answers. I left home at 18 with a scholarship and a hunger to become someone different, someone louder, someone freer, someone who did not carry silence like an inheritance. I called my mother every Sunday, but my conversations with my father were short. He asked about practical things, classes, rent, whether I was eating properly. I wanted him to ask about my dreams. I wanted him to be proud in a way I could hear. But he only said, "Work hard, don't waste the chance." At the time, I heard judgment in those words. Now, I hear sacrifice. When I came home for holidays, the suitcase was still there. Always. The apartment changed around it. The wallpaper peeled. The table was replaced. My sister married and moved away. My mother's hair turned silver. My father's back curved more deeply with each year, but the suitcase remained. I began to joke about it bitterly. "Still guarding the exit?" I once said. My father smiled faintly, but did not laugh. "Something like that," he replied. It took me too long to understand that some people do not keep things because they cannot let go. Sometimes they keep them because letting go once cost them everything. The year my father got sick, the suitcase looked smaller. Or maybe he did. He had always seemed solid to me, not because he was large, but because he endured. He endured bad bosses, long winters, broken English, unpaid bills, the loneliness of holidays celebrated without the people he grew up with. He endured without complaint, which made me assume endurance was easy for him. Then one morning my mother called and said he had fallen at work. "He says it is nothing," she told me, but her voice broke on the word nothing. It was not nothing. It was the beginning of hospitals, tests, quiet conversations in hallways, pill bottles lined along the kitchen counter, and my father growing tired in a way sleep could not fix. I came home more often then. At first, we talked about ordinary things because ordinary things felt safer. The weather, the neighbors, my job, my sister's children. But sickness changes the shape of time. It makes silence heavier, because everyone can feel how little of it may be left. One evening, I found him sitting in the hallway beside the suitcase. He was not touching it, he was just looking at it. The apartment was dim, and my mother had fallen asleep in the chair by the window. I sat down next to him, awkwardly, like a boy again. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Then I said, "Dad, what's inside?" He closed his eyes. I thought he might refuse. Instead, he whispered, "A life." I waited. He breathed slowly, gathering strength. "Not the one I lived," he said, "the one I left." That night, for the first time, he told me pieces of the story, not all of it. Men like my father do not open completely just because time is running out, but enough. He told me about the village where he was born, where mornings smelled of wet earth and bread, where his mother sang while hanging laundry, where his father kept bees behind the house. He told me about the girl he had once promised to marry before the world changed, and promises became luxuries. He told me about leaving with a ticket bought by selling his father's watch. "I thought I would go first," he said. "Work, save money, bring everyone later." He looked at his hands, but later is a dangerous word. Borders changed. Letters stopped. People disappeared into distance, into poverty, into decisions made by governments and strangers. He tried to send money. Sometimes it returned, sometimes no answer came. He married my mother years later, built a family, built a life, but some doors inside him stayed locked. "I did not leave because I loved them less," he said. "I left because I hoped leaving would save someone." Then he looked at me. "I think you children believed I was always looking back." His voice trembled slightly. "I was, but not because I wanted to leave you, because I wanted to understand the price of staying alive." He died 3 months later, early in the morning, while the city outside was still blue with dawn. My mother was beside him. I was driving across town when she called. By the time I arrived, the apartment was full of that strange quiet that comes after a person leaves a room forever. His shoes were by the door, his cap hung from the hook, the kettle was on the stove, and the suitcase stood where it had always stood, waiting. We did not open it that day. My mother said, Not yet. So we waited until after the funeral, after the relatives, after the food, after the condolences that all sounded the same. Then, one rainy afternoon, my mother, my sister, and I sat in the hallway around the suitcase. For the first time in my life, it seemed less like a threat and more like a witness. My mother handed me the key. I had never seen it before. "He kept it in his wallet," she said. Her eyes were red, but steady. "He said you should open it." My hands shook as I turned the lock. Inside, there was no treasure, no money, no secret escape plan, no evidence that he had ever meant to abandon us. There was a coat, carefully folded, worn thin at the elbows, a small cloth pouch filled with dark soil, a stack of letters tied with blue thread, a photograph of a young woman standing near an orchard, a child's drawing, faded almost beyond recognition, his father's broken watch, a prayer book with pages softened by touch, a train ticket he had never used, and beneath everything, wrapped in a white shirt, a pair of tiny shoes. My sister began to cry first. My mother covered her mouth. I lifted the shoes gently. They were old, handmade, meant for a very small child. For a moment, I did not understand. Then my mother whispered, "Your brother." I turned to her. She nodded slowly. Before me, before my sister, before America, there had been a child who died before my father could bring him across the ocean. A child he had never spoken of because the pain had no place to go. The suitcase had not been waiting by the door because he wanted to leave. It had been standing there because everyone he could not save had arrived with him anyway. The letters told the rest. Some were from his mother, some from his younger sister, some were never sent. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately, careful, slanted, humble. In one letter, written before I was born, he apologized to his father for selling the watch. In another, he promised his mother he would send enough money for medicine. In one, never mailed, he wrote to the woman in the photograph, "I have learned that love can continue, even after life chooses another road. I hope you lived. I hope someone was kind to you." Then, folded separately, there was a letter addressed to me. "My son," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have finally found a way to speak without making you watch me cry." I had to stop after the first line. When I could read again, I continued. He wrote that he knew I had misunderstood him. He wrote that he had not blamed me. "Children deserve fathers who can explain themselves," he said. "I was not always that father. I am sorry." He wrote that the suitcase had been the only piece of his first life he could keep intact. "I left many people behind so that one day you would not have to leave anything just to survive." He wrote that every hard shift, every extra hour, every silence at the dinner table came from the same place. Fear that his children might one day know the kind of choice he had known. "I wanted you to choose your life," he wrote, "not escape into it." At the bottom, in shakier handwriting, he had added one final line. "The suitcase was never by the door because I wanted to go. It was there to remind me why I stayed." I read that sentence again and again, until the words blurred. For most of my life, I had thought my father's silence meant distance. I had thought his tiredness meant indifference. I had thought the suitcase was a symbol of absence, when all along it was proof of presence. Every day he passed it on his way to work. Every night he came home to it. Not because he was waiting for another life, but because he was honoring the one he had sacrificed, and because, perhaps, he needed to be reminded that the pain of leaving had not been wasted. We were the reason. My mother, my sister, me, the noisy apartment, the repaired bicycles, the packed lunches, the shoes by the heater, the questions he never knew how to answer. After that day, we did not throw the suitcase away. We cleaned it. My mother placed the letters in a wooden box. My sister kept the tiny shoes wrapped in cloth. I took the broken watch and had it repaired, though it never kept perfect time. That seemed right. Some things are too wounded to become exact again, but they can still move. Years later, when I had a child of my own, I told her about her grandfather. Not the silent version I had invented when I was young, but the real one, or as much of him as I had finally been able to understand. I told her he crossed an ocean with grief in his hands and still managed to build a family. I told her he did not always say love, but he carried it in every ordinary act. I told her that sometimes people bring the past with them not because they are trapped there, but because they refuse to let it vanish. The suitcase no longer stands by my mother's door. It stands in my home now, near the window, where the afternoon light touches its worn leather. My daughter once asked me why I keep an old suitcase in the living room. I smiled, and for a second I heard my father's voice in mine. Because, I told her, some things are easier to understand when they stay close. She frowned, too young for the answer, just as I had once been too young for his, so I opened it for her. Not all the way, not yet, just enough to show her the photograph, the watch, the letters tied with blue thread, just enough to begin. And as she touched the old brass lock with her small fingers, I finally understood what my father had given me. Not a mystery, not a burden, a map, not of the country he left, but of the love that had carried him from one life into another. Every family has a suitcase like that. Maybe not made of leather, maybe not standing by the door, but somewhere, there is always something carried in silence, a sacrifice nobody explained, a grief nobody named, a choice that cost more than the children ever knew. We grow up thinking love should sound a certain way. We expect it to speak clearly, warmly, easily, but sometimes love sounds like footsteps leaving before dawn for work. Sometimes it smells like bread brought home after a long shift. Sometimes it is a repaired shoe, a paid bill, a hand resting quietly on the back of a chair. And sometimes, love is an old suitcase by the door, unopened for 20 years, holding everything a father lost so his children could have something more. I used to think my father never told us his story. Now I know he did. He just left it where we would find it when we were finally ready.